It's wonderful to be here with you, Dara. So we have here a room full of students, many of whom are working to try and address the issues of anti-Semitism, anti-Zionism on campus. You have now spoken at many campuses, spoken with many students. What are some of the trends that you see in this area in terms of the anti-Semitism that's plaguing our campuses today? What have you learned in your travels?
Well, first I just want to say thank you to ICC for inviting me and for having both of us. I'm really delighted to be here with you. And I want to say that I defer to the people in the room who are, living their lives on all these campuses, who know much more than I do as a person who parachutes in to speak at campuses. But I think that there's students are often sort of thrown into this sort of moments of cognitive dissonance, where they're asked to renounce part of themselves. And I think that happens over and over again. And I'm going to give one example from a college that I visited last year, which shall remain nameless. It was UC Santa Cruz. And I went to speak there, this was in the spring of 2022, so about a year ago, and someone had proposed a resolution in their student government that they wanted to pass a resolution that they were against anti-Semitism, using the IRA definition of anti-Semitism, which I'm sure people here are familiar with, and because of that, this was voted down in this student government. And so they've decided that they were not, in fact, against anti-Semitism. And what I think is interesting about this story is how you sort of connect the dots between ostensible anti-Zionist stance, which was the objection to using the IRA definition, to outright anti-Semitism, because they voted down this resolution. They said that, they decided they're not, in fact, against anti-Semitism. And having decided that they're not against anti-Semitism, apparently they decided that they were in favor of anti-Semitism, because about 4 days before I showed up to give my speech on campus, about a week after this resolution failed, the dorms are all spray painted with swastikas. And they cleaned this up before my talk, and I remember speaking with the provost there was telling me about this situation, and I asked her, do you think this was done by students, or was it people from the town of Santa Cruz? And she said, oh no, we definitely think it was students. And I said, how would you know that? Or what makes you think that? And I can't even say this without laughing. She says, because we found the spray paint cans in the recycling bin. I was like, I guess the philosophy is kill the Jews, save the turtles. So, I mean, there's sort of we've dropped any pretense that this is a conversation about politics or about Israel or anything like that. And that was sort of what was really striking to me traveling around speaking at different campuses, how I feel like there were times in the past where there were discussions about Israeli politics on campus where there might have been a lot of stridency and possibly a whole lot of bad faith, but we still were pretending that it was about some situation in the real world. And what's been striking to me is it doesn't feel like people are even trying to pretend anymore.
I think that's right. I think that in the past, like you say, at least there was this pretense that what was going on was a good faith political debate. And now there's no effort even to pretend. Now what it really is the shunning and the marginalization of Jewish students and Zionists on campus, trying to turn them into pariahs. This is an identity that's unacceptable. And if this is an identity or the way you define your identity, then you should know you will be shunned. You should know you won't be welcomed in certain spaces on campus. You have talked in your book also about different kinds or different types of anti-Semitism. Perhaps you could elaborate a little bit on that. I think you have a wonderful way of describing it.
Sure. So, yes, in my book, which is called People of Dead Jews, and I can't believe my publisher let me keep that title. And yes, actually, it's even worse than that. I also have a podcast called Adventures with Dead Jews, and the production team and I for that podcast were always joking about how we want to make merch, coffee mugs, tote bags, beach towels. No one's going to take your seat at the pool. with your, people love dead Jews speech towel, right? So yes, I've been making people uncomfortable with this book for a while, and there is a point in my book where I talk about sort of these two types of anti-Semitism that have plagued the Jewish people for thousands of years, and I name them after the Jewish holidays that celebrate triumphs over them: Purim and Hanukkah. So the Purim story is from the biblical book of Esther. It's this, this attempted genocide of the Jews in the Persian Empire in ancient times. And the story is like, that form of anti-Semitism is really obvious, right? Like, there's a big bad guy who's coming to kill all the Jews. Like, it's really clear, there's no ambiguity. The other holiday where we celebrate this triumph over anti-Semitism is Hanukkah. And what's interesting to me about the Hanukkah story is that there's no point in the Hanukkah story where anybody says, let's kill all the Jews. Doesn't come up. The goal is still to destroy Jewish civilization, but they're going to achieve that goal by making Jews not be Jewish. And I'm going to give one example from ancient times of this. So the way the Hanukkah story is about this ancient Greek, or this Hellenized empire. It's actually from Syria, but it's ancient Greek culture that takes over ancient Judea. And at first it's like this soft persuasion where they're like, well, we have this awesome Greek culture, which is obviously way more cool than your, pathetic Jewish culture. And, obviously you want to be part of this because like we're the cool kids. And at first the Jews of Judea actually go along with this. They're like, we can be a good vassal state. And one of the ways they try to adapt to this is they build a gymnasium in Jerusalem. And the ancient Greek, for the Greek games. And this is not like the way we think of athletics now, like NBA or something like that. Like, it's tied up with the religion. It's, it's like the core aspect of the culture. It's like what you need to do to be a person who matters is to participate in these Greek games. And at this point, the Jews of Judea have to recruit teenage Jewish boys to participate in these Greek games. Well, if you've ever been in an art museum, you might recall that Greek athletics were played in the nude. These Jewish teenage boys had their circumcisions reversed so they could participate in these Greek games. I don't even want to know how that's possible medically. But what I think is interesting about this story is that no one is making them do that. That's just what you had to do to be a person who mattered in that society. And it's only 5 years later that this regime outlaws circumcision and starts outlawing, observing Shabbat, the Sabbath, studying Torah, outlaws all these other Jewish practices. So this, what I call Hanukkah anti-Semitism, is this kind of weaponized shame, which requires Jews to erase themselves. And it's basically that there's this culture that regards itself as universal, and basically is saying whatever aspect of Jewish culture is like not cool this week is what we consider unacceptable. It's basically this non-Jewish society editing how a person is allowed to be Jewish, and it requires Jews to act as agents and to erase themselves. And there's quite a few examples of this through Jewish history. I actually think this form of anti-Semitism is much more common in Jewish history than the Purim version of there's this big bad tyrant who wants to kill everybody. That's much less frequent in Jewish history than this other cultural pressure where Jews are required in some way or another to erase themselves. And I spoke about this for a lot, but I don't know how many more examples you want me to give of how this plays out in Jewish history.
Sure, I think you're right, that it is exactly what we're seeing so often today on the campuses, where students are feeling pressured to hide what makes them Jewish, or to hide, right? I've had students who have told me, they won't wear T-shirts that have Hebrew lettering on them. Some will take off their Magen David, Star of David necklaces. They're afraid to post pictures of their trip to Israel on social media. I had a student who told me her favorite ring she bought in Israel, and she got complimented on all the time, and she would never tell anybody that she bought it in Israel. But really trying to erase whatever might define them openly as Jewish, because they're afraid of exactly this, that then they won't be in the group that's accepted, as you put it, the weaponized shame. I think that's right.
Well, and what people should know is that there's a long, long backstory to this. So I gave the example from Hanukkah, and what's amazing is it's always like what the larger society feels is universal and is editing away whatever aspect of Jewish life they consider to be disgusting. And because they regard this as disgusting, and it's sort of, there's nothing universal about that. The irony is that there's nothing universal about that opinion. What's universal is the pattern of all these different societies that are trying to make everybody conform, and the insecurity of these societies and their inability to tolerate difference. And also their need to get people from the Jewish community to do this to themselves. Like, that's like a crucial aspect of this form of anti-Semitism. And one part of it that I talk about that I think will be relevant for this conversation that you've been having this whole week is the way this plays out in the Soviet Union. There's in 1918, after there's the Bolshevik Revolution where they overthrow the Tsar in 1917. In 1918, the Bolsheviks in what's becoming the Soviet Union, they're waging civil war. They're trying to take over what was the Russian Empire. They need the millions of Jews of the former Russian Empire to be on their side in this civil war. And what they do to make that happen is they create what are called the Yevsektia. These are the Jewish sections of the Communist Party, whose goal is to spread Bolshevik ideology among the Jews of the former Russian Empire. And what I think is really amazing about this is the Yevseksia's ideology, their sort of like statement of purpose was, we are not anti-Semitic, we are just anti-Zionist, thank you, yes. And did you catch this? This is in 1918. This is 30 years before the state of Israel. Like, it's probably not about, whoever's in the, Knesset today. So what I think is sort of amazing about that, though, is that these were Jews who were sort of like recruited by the Bolsheviks to do this, and who participate in this. Of course, later they later end up, in the process. Oh, and by the way, we're not anti-Semitic. We're just anti-Zionist. Also, we're Marxists, so we're also anti-religious. So we love Jews. You just, can't practice Judaism, or we're Hebrew, or support Zionism, but otherwise we love you, right? And what's and of course, in the process of not being anti-Semitic and only being anti-Zionist, they managed to persecute, imprison, torture, and murder tens of thousands of Jews until, and of course this eats itself, right? Because then the Yevsektia themselves are then purged by the Communist Party because guess what? They're all Zionist spies trying to bring down the Soviet state. What an amazing coincidence. So, and then the Soviet Union later exports this slogan to their client states in the developing world. In the Arab world, of course, and also in Latin America and in progressive circles in North America as well. And that's part of how this this slogan makes its way to even in progressive circles in the United States today.
What that story also shows is that even those Jews, right, who thought that, okay, I can shed, right, what might be viewed as unacceptable, at the end of the day, that doesn't protect them, right? In other words, it's not as if giving up or shedding what makes you Jewish or outwardly Jewish is a guarantee to, oh, you'll then be left alone.
Yeah, that's not what happens. Not in this case. And yeah, in a sense, that doesn't, right, it's this sort of unfortunate way that people are, they're asked to erase themselves. And yeah, you're never gonna win that game. And I mean, I think that's sort of something important for young people to learn, because there's all kinds of choices and compromises we make as we get older and with our communities, and you never win when you give up your integrity for some kind of public acceptance. That's just, I mean, whether or not you end up you're probably not gonna end up in a gulag, right? I mean, hopefully you won't, but there's a cost to you. So that's what, sometimes I've had people ask me, you mentioned the example of people didn't want to post a picture of being in Israel. I've met students who said, they're on this 6-week trip in Israel, and these are people who they don't eat breakfast without posting it on TikTok, and they're these people on this bus are not posting that they're in Israel for 6 weeks. And, and I remember one student saying to me yeah, but there's this huge price you pay for posting these things or for getting involved in any of these kinds of conversations. And I said, well, yes, that's 1,000% true. And what is the price you pay for not posting? And which of those prices are you going to be paying for longer in your life? So that's, yeah, I don't think, I mean, that's just like a sort of a human lesson. I don't think that even this has to do just with Jewish identity. It's like compromising your integrity is like never gonna, you never win.
I think that the importance of trying to find the strength to maintain our identity, even if that makes us different. Right? You have a wonderful section in your book where you talk about how, since ancient times, that's what Jews have done. We've passed down from generation to generation our traditions. We've fought really to maintain our difference. And then you have this sentence that says, right, the existence of Jews in any society is a reminder that freedom is possible, but only with responsibility, and that freedom without responsibility is no freedom at all. And I thought maybe if you could talk a little bit about the importance of being able to accept and maintain this difference and still support a society with Jews who are different, not forcing them to be the same, how that actually totally is interwoven in our ability to maintain the freedoms that we all cherish and hold dear.
Yes, well, I think that this is where you butt up against what have some of the limits of the way we think about pluralism and diversity in this country. I think a lot of us growing up were taught a kind of a clunky lesson about pluralism taught by well-meaning people. And I feel like when we were growing up and teachers were trying to teach us to, hopefully someone in your life was trying to teach you not to be a bigot, one of the ways that that's often done is there's some kind of presentation where they say something like, oh, see this group of people over here who you might be inclined to be prejudiced against. You shouldn't hate those people because they're just like you and me. They're just like everybody else. And the problem with this very well-intentioned idea that I think so many of us have absorbed in our education, the problem with this idea is that Jews spent 3,000 years not being like everyone else. Uncoolness is sort of Judaism's brand. And I think this goes back to the ancient world where, the whole rest of the ancient Near East is worshiping this Marvel cinematic universe of sexy deities. And the Jews are like the losers in the school cafeteria where they're like, oh, we're over here with our glossy, unsexy, invisible God, right? Like, Jews have never been cool. And, there's this sort of Judaism is this counterculture that runs through the whole history of the West and often challenges the history of the West. And I think that what's really interesting about that is the challenge that it's posing now to sort of this idea of what it means to be in a pluralistic society. Because if you're teaching people, oh, you shouldn't hate somebody because they're just like everybody else, then it's like basically what you are, the part of the lesson you're also imparting, whether you intend to or not, is that if someone isn't just like you and me, if the person isn't just like everyone else, then it's actually fine to hate them, right? And maybe this is why Hasidim keep getting beat up in the streets, right? It's like, oh, they're not just like you and me, like they have a weird hairstyle, right? Like they didn't meet my standard of what's normal. And so I do think that this is that limit is also the limit of a democratic society, because the ability to maintain a democratic society and resist tyranny is all about the ability to hold a large number of people with a variety of different ideas, a variety of different, not just backgrounds, but a variety of different ways of being in the world, things that they consider most important. And sometimes those values are going to clash. And the only way you can have a society with true freedom is a society where you do not demand that kind of conformity, where you don't demand that everybody be like everybody else. And so, I have often pushed back against this idea. People often make this argument like, oh, we should all be against anti-Semitism because Jews are like the canary in the coal mine, right? Like when Jews are attacked, it's a sign that, later other people are going to be attacked. I was just like, think about how much you have to denigrate your own integrity to say something like that. Like, because when you make that argument, you're basically saying like, oh, when Jews are murdered or maimed, it could be an ominous sign that real people might be attacked later, right? I mean, it's like, literally canary in the coal mine. I'm like, you're the animal in this metaphor. I'm not liking this at all. But like, what I think is true in terms of the ramifications for anti-Semitism in a broader society is that it is a test of what does freedom really mean? Is it possible for us to have a variety of opinions and a variety of ways of being in the world. Because a society that allows that to flourish is a society where there's true possibilities for freedom and democracy. And societies that don't allow that are societies that are not going to succeed in the long run. I think that really is true.
So today, on the university campuses and even now in corporations, there's this whole push for the diversity, equity, and inclusion, right? To, I think, create or help create a better understanding or sensitivity to difference. And yet, there's this lack of awareness or sensitivity to how Jews fit into that mix, and the idea that Jews are also an ethno-religion, are also one of these groups that you need to realize are different. And so you had some stories too and experiences with the DEI folks. Can you share some of your thoughts about?
Yes, so I have done DEI presentations for, in college and university settings, but also in corporate settings. At one point I did like DEI for Google's worldwide employees. I've done also, other slightly smaller corporations, which is every other corporation in America except Amazon maybe. I've done a lot of, corporate type events like that are under this DEI rubric. There's a problem for Jews with this sort of ideological structure of DEI. And I go into those settings, and what I do is I bring up the problem. And the problem is this. Anti-Semitism is a little bit different from a lot of other bigotries in that it isn't really so much a social prejudice, it's a conspiracy theory. And the difference between a social prejudice and a conspiracy theory is that a social prejudice is that you think that this group of people is inferior to you, and that you feel that you're superior to this group of people and they're inferior to you. A conspiracy theory is weirdly the opposite. A conspiracy theory is that you think this group of people are actually superior to you, that they're these shady supervillains that are manipulating things behind the scenes. And so what that means then is that you're not punching down the way you would be for a group that you thought was inferior to you. You actually think that you're punching up and you're speaking truth to power, whereas actually, you're just repeating one of the oldest lies in the world. And so what I do when I speak in a DEI setting about this, I bring up that there's this weakness in the way DEI is often structured, which is that DEI is often structured around this idea that there's this hierarchy of power in society. And so if your whole approach to DEI is that you believe that there's this hierarchy of power in society, and that there's these elites, shadowy elites that are manipulating things behind the scenes to the detriment of everybody else in the society, you might be right. If you think about the way that corporate structures are set up in the United States, I mean, it's funny because I'm here I am speaking at Google, maybe you're the problem. It's a little weird that you're doing this. Leave that over here. But, I think that if that is your, you may be right, there may be merit to that worldview, but the problem is if that's your worldview, you're gonna fall face first into anti-Semitism, because the whole premise of anti-Semitism is that, if the whole premise of this DEI is that there are certain people who have too much power, too much privilege, and are overrepresented, that's the foundational conspiracy theory of anti-Semitism, is that Jews are this shadowy elite that have too much power, too much privilege, and are overrepresented. And you know how old this is? This is so old that people are oh yeah, it goes back to 1903 with the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, this Russian conspiracy theory. I'm oh no, it's older than that. It's in the book of Exodus. When the Pharaoh enslaves the Hebrews in the book of Exodus, why does the Pharaoh enslave the Jews? Because they have too much privilege, too much power, and they're overrepresented. Literally says their Hebrews are too numerous. And because of Joseph, who had come into that society and was in the second in command in the previous generation, the Jews have too much power, too much privilege, they're overrepresented, and we need to take them down. This is a foundational concept of anti-Semitism. The other problem is that there's this sort of attitude we often have in the United States about the way that progress works for minority groups, which is a statement which Martin Luther King was actually quoting someone else. It's not actually his quote. It's from some 19th century thinker. But this line where, the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice, right? We have this idea that things get incrementally better. There may be backlashes or setbacks, but things get incrementally better for minority groups as time goes on. This is not the pattern of Jewish history. The pattern of Jewish history much more often is that Jews are entirely integrated into the society, and then this conspiracy theory takes hold and then collapses. And again, goes back to, it's in the Hebrew Bible. I'm not claiming, whether or not you believe the Hebrew Bible is historical evidence. It is a pattern that is exhibited in the Hebrew Bible and that is repeated in many, many ancient societies where we have a lot of, external evidence for it. So, when you think about Joseph is the second in command of Egypt, and it's only after him that the people are enslaved. Queen Esther, she's a Jewish woman who's the queen of Persia, and that's when there's this genocidal decree, right? The Jews in Spain were the viziers of Spain before they were expelled from Spain. So, this is a very common pattern throughout Jewish history.
Yes, that's exactly right. They're cyclical, right? Jews flourish in a land and then they get expelled.
Yes, well, and so I'm not saying this is inevitable or anything like that, but it does fly in the face of what we're taught to expect as Americans and the way we're supposed to think about this.
Could you talk a little bit about how then should we educate, and maybe it's two separate groups, educate the administrators, the outsiders to understand anti-Semitism? What does that education look like? And then maybe also what's important internally in our Jewish community? Is there education that's important? How do we start to address this?
So, many people have, this is my first nonfiction book, People Love Dead Jews. My previous 5 books are all novels, and I was so dumb, I didn't realize that when you write a nonfiction book describing a problem, people expect you to solve the problem by the end of the book. And I'm spoiler, I don't solve this problem at the end of the book. And then, but since then, people have been, every time I do some public event, people ask what you just said, where they're basically so what's your solution to this problem? And my extremely tasteless reply is did you really want me to give you the final solution to the Jewish question? Because I wasn't prepared to give that to you. So that's a little bit, I'm all about good taste. And that's my obnoxious reply, but no, I'm not, I don't think I'm gonna solve this 2,500-year-old problem for you right now. But I do think there are ways that we can turn this conversation around. And one thing I've thought about, and last year I did a project, actually it just came out in The Atlantic a couple months ago. I did a very long reported piece for The Atlantic about American Holocaust education. And one of the things I noticed was that there are all these, many states have passed these mandates that people have to teach the Holocaust at school. And I'm not saying that that is a bad thing. I'm not against Holocaust education. I want to be super clear. But what I noticed is there's all these states where people are in public school are required to learn how Jews were murdered, but are not required to learn who Jews are. And I feel there's, and I realize the extent of this because I traveled around the country going to all these Holocaust museums, meeting teachers and administrators and people who create the curricula that maybe some of you went through in school. And I remember being in the Dallas Holocaust Museum for a teacher conference, and I was talking to one of the docents there, and I said, when students come through the museum, what do they typically ask? You know what he said? He said, you know what students ask? They say, are there still Jews alive today? Because if you went through this museum, you kind of wouldn't know. And I was why is it not required to teach people who Jews are? Because, it's so many times where often when I speak at college campuses, people will ask these questions where they're are Jews a race? Are Jews a religion? Are Jews a nationality? And I'm well, the problem with those questions is that Jews predate all of those categories. There isn't it's every non-Jewish society tries to put Jews into the box, the identity boxes that they know best, and the problem is the Jews predate the box. And, there's actually, who are Jews? And you watch this little video that sort of described this very well, but, Jews are a joinable tribal group. This is it's a type of social group that's very common in the ancient Near East and just uncommon in the West today. It's a joinable tribal group with a shared homeland, history, and culture. Part of that culture is a non-universalizing religion. What I just said was a paragraph in English. In Hebrew, it is one word. that's 2 letters long. Yeah. So it's like, we don't have the language for that, but like, you can teach people those things. Like, why are we not teaching people like the basics of Jewish civilization? And this is something I've thought about a lot in terms of like, think about what it might have said in, those of you who were most recently in high school. Like, what does it say in your high school history textbook about Jews? It probably says they died in the Holocaust, and boy, there was 50 years of effort on the part of the Jewish community to get that into the book. It says they died in the Holocaust. If it has something about ancient civilizations in it, maybe there's a paragraph about the Israelites. It probably doesn't mention that those people are Jews. They're just like, more dead people from a long time ago, who cares? And there's nothing in between, and there's nothing since. The problem is, if you were to include Jewish civilization in that education, it would upend a lot of the other things in the book. I don't know if I should. Okay, so I'm gonna give one tiny example, really tiny example, literacy. That same textbook, where Jews are erased from Western civilization and they only show up at the end in a mass grave, what does that textbook say about literacy? It probably says that until the printing press was invented, only wealthy people and the royalty and the clergy knew how to read, and nobody else knew how to read. And then, yay, the printing press was invented. And then, yay, a few centuries later, you have industrialized production. Yay, finally, literacy is available to the poor. And it's like a really nice story, but it's a lie. Because Jewish communities have had widespread literacy for like at least 1,000 years before the printing press. Like, poor kids in 12th century Yemen in Jewish communities knew how to read. Poor kids in 9th century Libya knew how to read, right? And the problem is, if you included that story in the textbook, it would ruin the other story, right? Because it would show like, oh, actually you don't need advanced technology to have widespread literacy, you just need a society that thinks reading is important. Like, that would kind of ruin the story, but like, imagine how that would broaden the story and change what you thought you knew about the possibilities for our society. It would change the whole story. And I do think that there's an opportunity now in our, because there's so much going on in our country right now in terms of like, because of, DEI and these kinds of initiatives, and rethinking the way we think about how culture is made, rethinking like what we consider foundations of our civilization. I don't agree with all of those reformulations, but I think there is a place for Jewish civilization to be a foundational part of this conversation. Now, you might say about that high school history textbook example, there's a lot of people who are not in that textbook, to be fair. The Yazidis are probably not in that textbook either. But my response to that is, the Yazidis are not foundational to the history of the West. Judaism is foundational to the history of the West. You cannot understand the history of Western civilization without understanding Judaism. And also, so much of Western civilization has defined itself against Judaism. And that sort of Judaism being this sort of counterculture that challenges the history of the West. You just can't understand that story if you erase the history of the Jews.
So I agree with you. This is an extremely important part of education. One of the challenges, though, is that even within our own community isn't fluent in this, all of the richness of this history and this heritage. So what are some of the things, if you were to think about a curriculum for within the Jewish community even, for Jews to try and understand more about their history, their heritage. I know you teach Yiddish literature too.
Yes.
Maybe talk a little bit about why the significance and the importance of literature or other pieces to that education and what we need internally in order to be able to help educate externally.
Yes. Look, I actually think that a lot of the sort of widespread ignorance, as you say, within the Jewish community, I used to sort of blame the community for that. I used to feel very resentful about that. And I now sort of understand it as this sort of long generational story of internalized anti-Semitism. And it was a way of our ancestors protecting themselves in trying to assimilate their American Jewish families as best they could. And that was a choice that was made. But I want to speak about literature. So yes, I'm a novelist, so this is like my favorite thing to talk about. And yeah, I have a doctorate in Hebrew and Yiddish literature. And actually, I think the literatures really illustrate immediately this countercultural ideas of Judaism that sort of highlight, some of the, the problems with what we think of as like our culture. When I was in graduate school for comparative literature, I was studying, I was studying Hebrew and Yiddish, but like, I had to take all these like literary theory classes and learned a lot about like plot structures and things. And as I was learning these things, I also was writing novels. And I was hearing from readers who would often write to me about what they thought about my novels, and usually it was nice and sometimes it wasn't. And I just remember one reader who wrote to me about one of my novels, a book called The World to Come, and there's a character in there who's a pogrom survivor. And this reader wrote to me like, "Dear Miss Horn, I was reading your book, The World to Come, and I got to this section about where this part about the horse being beaten, and I threw the book across the room. I feel the purpose of literature is for us to laugh and enjoy and be uplifted. Thanks, Denise." And I'm like, so I wrote, but I did not send a reply to Denise where I was like, "Dear Denise, sorry about the horse. It was a reference to Crime and Punishment. That's another book you might want to avoid. You might also want to avoid the Hebrew Bible. Not a great book for people who want to laugh and enjoy. I do have some Garfield comics I could recommend." But like, what I thought was interesting though is there was, because I was studying literature and writing literature and dealing with like readers who had these expectations, I started realizing like there's so much that we think is like basic to literature that is not basic to literature. So, for example, think about what we want out of a story. We want the good guys to be saved. If that doesn't happen, we want the main character to have an epiphany. And if that doesn't happen, we want there to be like a moment of grace. Do you notice these are all Christian terms? Like, all of this sort of like, there's this like overarching layer of like Christian theology in our expectations of literature. And the reason I noticed it, because I was reading books in Jewish languages. So when I say Jewish literature, I mean specifically books that are written in a Jewish language. In Hebrew and Yiddish, there's actually been 20 Jewish languages in world history. And I just noticed these writers, they don't give you any of those things. Like, when you read Shalom Aleichem, the Yiddish writer Shalom Aleichem, the Tevye the Dairyman stories. Now, you might sound familiar to you from the adaptation in Fiddler on the Roof. Well, Fiddler on the Roof left out a few things. Like, for example, Tevye doesn't live in a shtetl. That's a little different from what we saw in Fiddler on the Roof. Also, like, super depressing, like, one of the daughters kills herself. Also, Chava gets abandoned by her non-Jewish husband and returns to her family. Like, there's a lot of stuff that didn't make it to Broadway. But what I think is really interesting is that, like, you read through those stories, and it's all these stories that where, all these, like, terrible things happen to this character. And, Tevye never, he never learns anything. He never has an epiphany. Like, he never has a moment of grace. He's never rescued or saved. Instead, he keeps enduring, which feels so realistic. The last line of that book in Yiddish, which would never have made it to Broadway, is Tevye saying to the author Shalom Aleichem, "Shalom Aleichem, go out and tell all of our Jews everywhere that our old God still lives." It's this story of endurance and resilience. And there's this sort of humility in it where it's like you can't be true to the human condition while pretending to like tie everything up in a bow at the end of the book. And so I do think that like there's sort of this structural element to storytelling. And I do think you see it even in Torah stories, right? I mean, if you think about the Torah, like just the 5 books of Moses, it ends with a cliffhanger, right? Like they don't go into the promised land at the end of the book, which you'd think like, here we are in the promised, like, nope, that's like sequel, right? Like, here, like we end with a cliffhanger, like, and then Moses dies. And they were really sad. Maybe they'll make it to the promised land sometime, but like not now. Now we're just gonna go back and start the book over, right? Like there's sort of this like understanding that like it's about asking a question and not about having an answer, and it's about this sort of open-endedness. And I think that story structure comes from this resilience in Jewish history and in Jewish experience, because what you see these Jewish artists, really writers, doing through centuries is creating these stories that are where they don't try to sort of solve all the problems, so to speak, but instead there's this kind of creative resilience that these characters show, where it's like, the story is like, now that you've lost everything you thought you had, now what? It's like what psychologists call post-traumatic growth. And I think that there's, look, I've taught Yiddish and Hebrew literature many, many times. I think you'll find a lot of these structures in contemporary Israeli literature too. But I think you find these structures even when you study Torah. When you study Torah, you see these sort of open-ended stories that, where you don't know there's no moral of the story. It's not like this is supposed to teach you a lesson, right? It's the conversation about the story is the lesson.
So in other words, it's fascinating. The idea is that the education is not just to teach the data, to teach the history, to teach the facts, but to actually try to inculcate the resilience, the ability to endure, the recognition that there may not be a nice, easy answer or a clear solution.
Well, if there is, it's probably wrong. Yeah.
And that just the lesson to be learned is to find that strength to keep going.
Yes, and also just like that this conversation continues, because there's some like values that I see as inherent to Jewish tradition that honestly we could use a lot more of in the United States, in the broader American community. So I'm going to give one example is the idea we have in the rabbinic tradition, so post Bible, rabbinic tradition of what's called mahloket l'shem shamayim, which is an argument for the sake of heaven, which is people arguing where they're never going to come to a conclusion, but the argument itself is holy because of the respect they give to each other, despite their irreconcilable differences. The Talmud is like 3,000 pages long, and the reason it's 3,000 pages long is because the Talmud is like this ongoing conversation about Jewish law. It's not like a list of rules. It's not even like a commentary on the Hebrew Bible. It's conversations between sages over the course of like 5 centuries about the meaning of Jewish law. And the reason it's so darn long is because it includes the opinions of everyone in the argument, not only the people who won the argument. And like, it's like, you could make this, like, this whole thing could be like, 150 pages if you eliminated all the people who lost the argument. But they're all there.
Just to kind of bring it back to the campuses today and that history, and I want to open it up for questions, but just to kind of tie up what you just said now, our whole Jewish tradition, our whole heritage is all about this debate, this back and forth, engaging in that conversation. And so the irony that today, right, the Jewish students often are the ones who are being accused of trying to silence the debate or the speech is so absurd, because Jews don't shy away from debate. We never have.
Yeah, we're not going to be silent.
No, not at all. So I wanted to be able to leave some time for the questions from the audience. I'm sure that people have many. I don't know if is there somebody who's going to be walking around with a microphone?
So we're going to go back and forth between the CVent app. Please use that to submit questions, and also questions from the floor.
Excellent. So then that disembodied voice, are you going to be? We
can't actually see you. We're blinded by the light.
We actually have a number of mic runners because we have such a large space. So I'll be right here. We'll have someone back here, and in each corner. So feel free to go ahead.
Okay, I just wanted to thank you for coming first. I'm a huge fan of your book, and I brought it with me when I saw that you were going to be speaking.
Oh, thank you.
I just think you're brilliant and hilarious and amazing.
If only my children felt this way, right? But like, really.
So in chapter 4, you state that Hanukkah anti-Semitism inevitably becomes Purim anti-Semitism, and seeing as Hanukkah anti-Semitism is becoming so rampant on college campuses, how do you think that, are like attacks on synagogues like a manifestation of that, or is there something worse to come, or just, what do you think?
Yeah, like, are you, I'm kind of a prophet of doom, is that what you're saying? Yeah, like, I'm sort of a prophet of doom. Like, yeah, look, I'm 46 years old, and I grew up at a time when, like, this wasn't really a problem. I know that sounds stupid, but, like, it's really true. Like, I went to college, I graduated in 1999, and this wasn't happening. believe it or not. This isn't like I mean, anti-Semitism is a forever thing, but like this kind of dynamic that's going on a lot of campuses really was not happening when I was a student. I think that it is a sign of an illiberal approach in our society, and that is concerning to me. So I think that sort of the rejection of debate is a problem, is a huge problem, and the rejection of this like liberal idea of like a pluralism of opinion is a problem. So, so when I say it inevitably becomes forum anti-Semitism, that doesn't mean like, I mean, yeah, inevitably sounds like, yeah, we're on a track to doom. We have the opportunity to change this now. We have an opportunity to change this conversation. There's often that saying like, oh, Jews have, like not saying, but like that's often people have said like, oh, Jews are excluded from this DEI network. Except that like I have been invited to speak at these DEI events. And I agree that it wouldn't have happened like 2 years ago or 3 years ago, but it's starting to happen now. I was involved in the White House plan to combat anti-Semitism. They called me to, I'm like, wow, I'm like, you guys are really out of ideas. You're like talking to a novelist. It was like kind of sad. Like everyone's out of ideas. But I do think there are starting to be more people understanding that this is a problem and taking it seriously. And I think that, so I don't believe in this, and I actually think that this is a very Jewish idea too, is the idea that you can affect the course of history, that events are not inevitable. I think that that's a foundational Jewish idea, and I can trace it back to the Torah for you, but I'm not gonna bore you with that. I do think that it is in our ability to change those conversations. The way to change those conversations is to participate in them. And that can sometimes be really uncomfortable. But, like I wrote a book called People Love Dead Jews. I love being uncomfortable and making other people uncomfortable. You sort of have to be ready to be uncomfortable. But I do think that, yes, illiberal ideas lead to illiberal societies. I don't think that that's debatable. And I think that, but what I think is debatable is the steps that we can take to change that conversation.
Okay, and then we're going to take a question from the app. We're going to go back and forth. How do you promote the successes of Jewish civilization without then giving legitimacy to a claim of superiority?
People have asked me this before, and I think the question is so bonkers because, like, the question itself reveals this sort of inherent idea that, it reveals how deep this, like, conspiracy theory goes in our society. I'm not saying the person who asked this question, like, is promoted, has internalized this anti-Semitism or something, that's not what I'm saying, but I think, like, people have asked me, it's like, well, wouldn't it be bragging if we talked about, like, the way, that Jewish civilization has introduced these ideas to Western civilization or something like that? And I'm like, no, it would be historically accurate. Like, when we say, like, isn't it bragging how, like, ancient Greece created democracy? Like, it's such a, like, that's such a brag that, like, people in Greece are like, oh, my ancestors invented democracy. I'm like, nobody says that, right? Like, nobody's like, oh, those Greeks, they're so high on themselves. Like, no, like, there's, like, lots of things that lots of cultures have contributed to the world, and this is one of them. And, to say, like, what is it? And I think that it's just, there's basic things that, like, we're not telling people. I don't understand why we can't tell people those things. Can I share one little example of that? So, like, for example, I remember I was at a DEI event in Kansas City, and they were telling me about something stupid that had happened in their city, whatever that week was, where somebody was standing on a street corner for 8 hours a day, in some busy intersection in Kansas City, holding a giant sign that said, "It's the Jews." And this person doing this DEI event with me was like, well, obviously this is this anti-Semitic provocation. And I'm like, well, yes, on our planet, that's what it is. But, like, imagine an alternate universe where the person holding the sign saying it's the Jews, what they mean by that is, it's the Jews, they invented the weekend. Like, we can sort of say that as a joke, but, like, there's an anti-Semitic stereotype that was common in the ancient world that now no one knows about anymore. In the ancient world, there was an anti-Semitic stereotype that Jews are lazy. And the reason this was an anti-Semitic stereotype was because people from these conquering empires came to ancient Judea and saw poor people not working. Because in the ancient world, only wealthy people had leisure, whereas in the Jewish community, we have this idea of Shabbat, where everyone, including people, at the bottom of the social totem pole, including even domesticated animals, are required to rest. This was such an alien idea. Whereas now it's like completely standard. We accept that like everybody is entitled to the dignity of being able to decide what they do with their time for some period of, for some regular interval in their week, right? Like even the idea of a week. Like this is just stating facts. I don't understand like the fact that we are shy and afraid to state facts. Like, what are we gonna do? Not share facts and just be like, well, I mean, take that as like, is this part of some vast some vast conspiracy theory that the Jews are trying to take over the world by giving you a day off once a week? Like, I just like, there's something like the idea that would be considered superiority. It's like, are people saying like, oh, it's a superiority that like people tell you that people in ancient Islamic empires invented algebra? Look how superior they are. It's like, no, that's just a historical fact.
There are, so many of these principles. You talk about Shabbat, a day of rest, just the whole basic idea of equality, the notion that all humankind is created in God's image, which is where you get the principles of equality from, also was a notion that the Jews introduced to the world. It was a totally radical concept at the time.
And that like many millions of people beyond the Jewish community benefit from these ideas. Like, it's just like the way like, everybody's learning algebra. They're not like, oh, that's something for like, people from the Arab world because they invented it. Like, no, that's the whole point of like, that's like how cultures interact and how we all are better for it.
Hi, thank you again so much for being here. I'm a huge admirer of your work, and I really love your philosophy and your approach. And I wanted to ask you about, there's a lot of talk today about reclaiming Zionism. And I know there's various articles been written, and it's telling students not to be afraid and speak openly. I just want to know what you think is effective. Like, what have you seen work when you speak to people in these DEI initiatives about Jews and about Zionism that we can implement on our campuses when we do this thing?
Well, so I think there's probably a lot of sessions at this conference where you talked a lot about this topic, and probably people who are talking about it better than I am. I think that the integral quality of Zionism to Jewish civilization is something that you can't dismiss. And I think that redefining for people, not redefining for Jews, we've known who Jews are for thousands of years, but explaining it to people is helpful because people really don't understand like that question, are Jews a religion, are Jews a nationality, are Jews a race? It's like, step back from that conversation and be like, you're using the wrong words. And we have this word called right? And that this is like a standard thing for people in the ancient Near East, right? There's still other Near Eastern groups that are organized in this way. And that this is something that is so integral to Jewish identity, is the connection to the land of Israel. That there's 613 commandments in the Torah, and like, I don't know what percentage of them, but it's a huge percentage of them, like, are things that were supposed to happen in the land of Israel, like agricultural things. If you think about the holidays we celebrate, all of them are tied to the agricultural cycles of the land of Israel. Like, we pray for rain on the day when the rains come in Israel. Like, rains do not come before the month of Cheshvan. And rains stop in the month of Nisan. And that's why we say prayers for rain for that half of the year, and we say prayers for dew the other half of the year. And we're praying for rain and dew because Israel was unusual among ancient Near Eastern civilizations in that they didn't have a river. Right? Other civilizations like in Mesopotamia and Egypt were like focused on a river where they didn't have to like constantly worry about this, whereas like part of the Jewish relationship with God has to do with this relationship to water, right? Because it's like all of your water comes from the sky. So it's like you are reliant on this cycle of rain and dew. So it's like you can't, there's no form of Judaism that like is completely divorced from this unless you're actively choosing to sever that piece of Judaism from yourself. So I think just like making that clear to people, because people really think like it's a religion the way that like Christianity or Islam is a religion. Like that it's like a set of beliefs. It's a set of beliefs and practices, but that's a piece of Jewish culture, but it is not the full picture of Jewish culture. So I found that just sort of taking a step back and explaining that to people is sometimes helpful, framing it that way. The other thing, there's another analogy, and this is, I want to warn you that this analogy is limited. But I've often had people ask me at college events some version of the question of can't I be anti-Zionist without being anti-Semitic? And and often they'll be asking this really just they're not heckling me, they're just asking me out of curiosity. And sometimes I explain that sort of history of anti-Zionism being, coming, from the Soviet Union and before that, and sort of being this way that non-Jewish societies edit your Jewish identity. And what I have found is this analogy, like I said, which is limited, sometimes works for people. I said, I explained that Zionism is integral to most aspects of Jewish civilization. It is a foundational pillar of Jewish civilization. And what I then say is this is that question of can't I be anti-Zionist without being anti-Semitic is in a sense, it's the non-Jewish society editing how you are allowed to be Jewish. It's saying this part of your Jewish identity is okay and this part isn't. And I, as a person who's not in that community, I get to decide. And this is the analogy that I use. I say, imagine if I said to people in the LGBTQ community, we love you, and we're not homophobic at all, and we're totally thrilled to have you here in our community, and we are so accepting, and we're so happy that you're here. Thank you so much for being here. We're not homophobic at all. Never bring your partner with you in public anywhere ever. We love you. What I'm basically saying would be I, a straight person, I get to decide how you get to be gay. And that's not bigoted at all. For me to decide how you get to be gay. And I think most people, and certainly in college situations, maybe someone who's actually homophobic will agree with this, right? You would not say that that's a way of not being homophobic. You would say that's a way of me imposing and putting you in the closet, because that's what it is. You're shoving somebody into the closet while claiming that you accept who they are. That's the opposite of accepting who someone is.
If I could just add to that too, because I think that what I've seen work or been helpful is when students are able to say, look, each of us defines our own identity for ourselves. Not every Jew defines their identity as including Zionism, right, as part of their Jewish identity.
That's right.
And the Zionism is, right, that's when I'm celebrating the shared history, the shared ancestry, the shared ethnicity, the shared part, the celebration of what it has meant for centuries to be Jewish, which is totally wrapped up in the land of Israel. And if I choose to define my Jewish identity that way, it's not for you to tell me I can't. And it's not for you to tell me that I have to shed that part of how I define my Jewish identity in order to be accepted, in order to engage. And as I said, just like not all Jews are Zionists, not all Jews are Sabbath observers.
Yes.
And yet you do not have to be yourself a Sabbath observer to recognize discrimination of a Sabbath observer on the basis of their Sabbath observance. By the same token, you don't yourself have to be a Zionist to recognize when Zionists are being excluded on the basis of this component of their identity.
Thank you so much. What an amazing session. Thank you so much, Dara and Alyza. Now we're going to have a 15-minute break and then refer to your CVent app to see which breakout session you're going to. So we will